Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Territory Talk on the Four Corners Network, where we review and discuss Vice TV's Tales from the Territory series. I am your host, professional wrestler Kris Rex, and usually by my side is my tag team partner in everything, John Punn. Unfortunately, he cannot make it on this episode as he's spending time with his family during the Thanksgiving holiday. And I hope you all enjoyed your Thanksgiving holiday with your family, stuffed your faces, drank some beer, drank some alcohol, smoked a little 420 if that's what you're into. And I hope you guys just enjoyed the holidays. On this episode, we're going to Dallas, Texas for WCCW World Class Championship Wrestling. One of the most infamous, one of the most notorious, one of the most prestigious wrestling promotions during the Territory days, ran by the famous Von Erich family. Now on this roundtable, we had Brian Edius, Jimmy Garvin, Kevin Von Erich, David Manning, and Chavo Guerrero Jr. Now to start off, David Manning credits WCCW for introducing entrance music and vignettes to wrestling. So they were like the first promotion to actually use real music, entrance music for their wrestlers and promos, vignettes, and all these storyline ideas, and brought it to wrestling. And Kevin Von Erich puts over how the talent and everyone who was there, they wanted to be there and they wanted to be the best at what they did. Manning was known as being Fritz's right-hand man in WCW, and he recalls when Fritz actually snubbed the NWA and told them that they were going to go out on their own. They were originally part of the National Wrestling Alliance, which was at the time, the governing body for the territories for wrestling at that time. And Fritz split away and had this vision of his own in his head where he can do it on his own. And I would say he was quite successful from branching off from the NWA. Now, you want to talk about some talent that came through WCCW and even got their start with WCCW. We talk about Rick Rude, King Kong Bundy, the Dingle Warrior, who would go on to become the Ultimate Warrior, Cactus Jack, and Texas Red, who would go on to be known as The Undertaker. Not only did they bring in those talents who kind of got their start in Texas, but they brought in legends, lucha libre legends like El Santo. And there's a funny story that Manning tells about bringing in El Santo when he was already 70 years old. And Fritz's one request is, please don't let the man die in the ring. But there was so much prestige behind this promotion. And we get, of course, we get the stories. And one of the first stories that we get in this episode is about gentleman Chris Adams, who was a great worker. The master of the super kick, kind of brought the super kick into wrestling and kind of made it that what it is today, honestly. Shawn Michaels would not be using the super kick if it wasn't for gentleman Chris Adams bringing it in. So he was really kind of the innovator of the super kick. Now, it's been said that he's a great worker and he liked to have people like him. But there's a story of a time that they went to Mexico, him and Brian, Chris Adams and Brian went to Mexico, and they were the only gringos there, which they were the only white boys there. They were the only Americans there. So they're drinking, and Chris Adams gets into an argument with some locals. Never a good idea. Well, one of the guys reaches for a gun. So Brian just ducks, and he sprints for the door. He's out. He's like a bat out of hell. And he's outside, and he hears bullets bouncing off the cars behind them. So he runs and gets back across the border first and waits for Chris in the hotel room. As soon as Chris walks into the room, he slaps Chris in the face, and he told Chris that there is no way that you can do that in another country. Like, you can't just go to another country and start some shit like that. And Brian learned that night that you don't go out drinking with gentleman Chris Adams. And he said that he hates talking about someone who's no longer with us, but mentions that Chris Adams was a blackout drunk. And the next morning, he had no idea, no recollection of anything that happened, of being in Mexico, running from the locals who were fucking shooting at them. No recollection whatsoever. So that just goes to tell you how heavy of a drinker that gentleman Chris Adams was. Now, Chavo Guerrero brings up how popular WCCW was in Israel. For whatever reason, their show was available in Israel, and it became one of the top shows in the Middle East. And they had made a joke that the one peaceful night in the Middle East was Saturday when there was wrestling on, because there's always been that which seems like a lifelong feud in between the Palestine and Israel, and so it seems like the one peaceful night was when there was wrestling on. Now, to capitalize on that popularity that they had in Israel, they ran a show. They went to Israel to run a show, and what does Adams do? Gentleman Chris Adams winds up getting into an argument with the bartender, and he beats him up. He beats up the bartender in Israel, and the guy tries to run. So what does Adam do? Adam hits him with the super kick. But he hits him with the super kick so hard that he knocked the guy's eye out. Wow. I wish Pun was here on this, because now we have our fourth episode with someone's eye coming out of their fucking socket. And this time with a super kick. I wouldn't believe this, but it must be true. So he knocks the poor guy's eye out with a super kick. And they're told by the promoter helping run the show that they have to get Chris Adams out of the country as soon as fucking possible. I mean, there is about to be a hunt for this man. Now, when you're in the United States, there's different laws, and there's different laws in other countries that are way more stricter. And you have to, when in Rome, you have to follow their rules, no matter how strict or whatever. But even in America, I think punching a guy, assaulting a guy, the cops would be after you. And I think gentleman Chris Adams should have known better. But when that alcohol takes into effect, especially with Chris Adams, you don't know what side of him you're going to get. So they have to get the man out the country as soon as possible. So what Manning had heard was that they had took Chris Adams' passport and they had it behind the counter at the hotel. So David Manning had to hide behind the counter in the hotel, and pretty much make sure the coast was clear so that he can go searching for Chris Adams' passport. Fortunately, he was able to find Chris Adams' passport. Now the next thing was getting him to the airport and on the flight without him being recognized, and hopefully that no word was put in to not allow him to fly. Luckily, they did make it to the airport, and they rushed him on the plane. After they get him on the plane, next thing you know, the police are waiting for him at the hotel, and they run into Manning, and they're questioning him, and he says, I don't know where he is, and they're really questioning him hard because they want Adams. He's gonna serve some time. If things didn't work out the way they did, David Manning had said that he thinks that they would still be in Israel if they weren't able to get Chris Adams out. They would pretty much still be prisoner in Israel. We get another story, another gentleman Chris Adams story, where WCCW did a show in San Juan, Puerto Rico, but it was delayed, and they made the decision to give a plane full of wrestlers free alcohol. Well, here we go, gentlemen. Chris Adams is not going to turn down free alcohol, so he's drinking and drinking. He has another one, and another one, and another one, and another one. Eventually, they try to cut off gentleman Chris Adams, and he doesn't take the news very well. He started bitching at the flight attendants. So they told the pilot, and the pilot decided, well, I'm gonna put this guy in his place. So he kind of like bowed up to Adams, and that ended pretty poorly for the pilot, as Adams legit headbutted the pilot and broke his nose. The police were there this time, and Adams wound up getting 6 months in federal prison for this incident. Again, I don't think I could be the type to hang out with Adams, because I'm the type of person, I don't like to get into shit, and to be around someone that's gonna constantly get me into shit, man, I would not drink with this man. Rest in peace, gentlemen, Chris Adams. Definitely some funny stories when you think, and these little stories again when you hear about the 70s and the 80s of I was almost saying independence, of the territory days. You always hear of these stories, and these are the stories to me that is like, wow, what a time to be alive, for the good and for the bad. Now, we get into Kevin Von Erich, who was the oldest of the Von Erich brothers and is noted as being one of the most athletic of the brothers. Well, the most athletic of the brothers. Brian talks about turning heel and how he had to work a lot with Kevin Von Erich. Well, one thing he learned about Kevin Von Erich is how stiff he was. And the heels in the locker room would laugh at whoever had to wrestle Kevin because of how stiff he was. And Manning begins to talk about the day he met Kevin Von Erich. He was a freshman at North Texas, and on his first day, Kevin broke all their weight room records. Kevin Von Erich broke all the weight room as a freshman, and Kevin Von Erich jokes that he never really worked on his legs, and he always seemed to have these strong legs. And it seemed every time he worked on his upper body, his legs got bigger. David Manning calls Kerry a workhorse, and Kevin as a thoroughbred. He was just so naturally gifted with this. Not only did he grow up in the business, but he had the physical capability and the mental capability to do this, and he was just such a naturally gifted athlete. Kevin Von Erich tells a story of working with Buddy Roberts, and he caught him with a foot to the face. And to this day, he jokes that Buddy's dental imprint is still in his foot. So as Kevin's getting taken care of by the medics in the back, someone had told Kevin that Buddy Roberts doesn't brush his teeth often, and that they joked that he may need a rabies vaccine. Well, they sewed the foot shut, and the next day, the stitches popped open, and he jokes that he would have been better off being bit by a copperhead snake than being bit by Buddy Roberts. To show how strong and how much of a tolerance for pain that Kevin Von Erich had, we get into the next story where Kevin has this bad tooth and he's just complaining to everyone about it, And listen, tooth pain, I know tooth pain. There's times where tooth pain is the worst in the world. It's like the worst pain to deal with. And it doesn't seem like it, but it is when you have to go all day with an infection, or you got this loose tooth. Well, Kevin's idea to take care of it was he got a pair of pliers from a maintenance worker, and he wanted David to pull the tooth, but he wouldn't do it. So Kevin tries to do it himself, and after a few tries of, struggling, he pulls and gets the tooth removed. Just think about that, people. With a pair of pliers, removed his own tooth like nothing. And I mean, that just goes to show the toughness of Kevin Von Erich. And I'm sure the whole Von Erich family was that tough. Now, when you think of world-class championship wrestling, when you think of the Dallas Sportatorium, you think of the Von Erichs versus the Freebirds. And that was probably one of the biggest, if not the biggest, feud in WCCW, and probably the territories at the time. Well, the Freebirds, they were partiers. I'm sure a lot of people were partiers in the 80s, as we've come to find out. Well, Jimmy Garvin says that he drank with the Freebirds, and they would often party together. The Freebirds had a house, and Jimmy would stay with them. One night they forgot the key, and Terry Gordy had said he had a key, and just kicks the door off the frame. And they never fixed the door. Instead, they would just prop the door up at night. And since they were always drinking, they kept the temperature at 68 degrees. Well, one night, Buddy is celebrating a sold out building by doing a backflip on a coffee table and then decides to set the coffee table on fire. Well, what does that lead to, people? What else do? You wind up burning all the rest of the furniture in the house and create a firestorm in the house. The round table starts discussing Terry Gordy and how great he was. And we get a story of how intimidating Terry Gordy was. One day he was getting pissed at a car dealership for not having his car ready. So what does he do? He takes the car, he drives it in to the car dealership, jumps on the hood, and pisses all over the floor of the car dealership. I see Terry Gordy doing this. And then he bitched at all of the employees until they apologized to him and they fixed the issues with the car. Chavo Guerrero Jr. goes on to mention that even to this day on TV, there's no feud like the Von Erichs versus the Freebirds. And they start discussing the origins of the Von Erichs versus Freebirds feud. The Freebirds originally came in as baby faces, and the plan was to turn them. They just need the right way to do it. And it led to Ric Flair versus Kerry Von Erich. And this would be the night that the wrestling business changed forever. It was Ric Flair defending the NWA World Heavyweight Championship against Kerry Von Erich inside a steel cage. Now, during these times, a cage match only happened about once a year. So that's what made it a really big deal. And it was usually used to blow off a feud. Michael Hayes is the special guest referee, and the idea was that Michael would get into the match and end up costing Kerry the match. Michael Hayes wanted Kerry to win by shenanigans, but of course, Kerry Von Erich was too pure of heart for that. He was too much of a babyface to let that happen. So during the match, Terry Gordy thinks that Kerry Von Erich decked Hayes. So he slams the cage door on Kerry Von Erich's head. And Manning thought that Kerry was dead because of how hard the cage caught him and how he sold it. The girls in the crowd were crying as Flair was able to escape with his title due to this big turn. It would start a series of events that would set the promotion on fire and became one of the best angles in the history of the business. And to this day, Brian still has people coming up to him asking about the Von Erichs versus the Freebirds. And you want to talk about stables. When you think about stables, like those two stables, even though I was not around during that era, even though I was not watching or I have not seen too much of that era, when I think stables, those are two names that come up first. Freebirds and Von Erichs. They're the perfect example of a stable versus stable feud. They're a perfect example of a cohesive unit, face versus heel. I mean, the matches that they had, the angles and the promos between each other, it made for great content at the time. Now, Chavo mentions how Jimmy Garvin was one of the first ones to come out with a valet in wrestling. Talks about working in Florida with Ernie Ladd, and Ernie Ladd had told him that he needed a gimmick. So he decided to update Gorgeous George for the 80s and got his cousin to be Sunshine. They all agreed that, she was natural, and they bring up the angle where David gave Sunshine a spanking. Now, Jimmy mentions Sunshine and Buddy would stay up all night drinking Jack, and, he worried about her. He knew he was going to replace her with his real-life wife, Patty, and it was his idea to call her Precious and make her the valet of Sunshine. It wound up becoming a soap opera, so to say, and they pretty much worked themselves into a shoot. The two women ended up feuding, and Garvin said he would cringe at how hard they would hit each other. I mean, these girls were legitimately fighting each other, and there was like serious real life heat between the two. And Jimmy Garvin would say that the character was hard to keep up with because of the blurred lines between gimmick, character, and reality. Now we get into our last story of the episode. And this one is titled Manning Saves the Day. Now, Chavo begins to talk about learning the ropes in the early days and having to tear down the ring and do other grunt work. Shit, I know that. Oh man, have I done so much of that. But that's how you pay your dues in this business. Now, Manning had a story about someone stealing money at a show and him pulling out a gun on them. The guy tried to run across a bridge, so Manning shoots 4 shots at him before the gun doesn't shoot anymore. He starts chasing the guy, and the guy hides behind a dirt pile. Now Manning winds up catching up with the guy who stole the money and splits his head open with the gun, like pistol whips him and splits his head open. The police come and need a statement, and the story that got around was that Manning had shot the guy in the face. But on this episode, he admits that he only shot 4 times in the air as kind of warning shots to try to stop the guy. But it's crazy how sometimes, like the game of telephone, one story you're gonna turn into another story and it gets blown out of proportion. I've heard that Dusty Rhodes was kind of good at that, as to where you didn't know whether the stories Dusty Rhodes told were true or not because he was such a good storyteller. I mean, if I was Manning, I would have stuck to the, shot the guy in the face. But maybe for police reports and stuff, that wasn't a good idea. But he got the money back, and they wound up settling it. But can you believe that? Some guy trying to run out of a wrestling show with money, like trying to steal money from wrestlers. I don't think that would fare well back then. Obviously, it didn't. And I don't think it would fare well today. I think you'd have a bunch of guys, especially with the guys and kind of what we get paid, and it's not really as much as people think they do. So you're literally taking the food out of our mouths by stealing money. To close out the show, they start talking about the legacy of world-class championship wrestling and how WCCW had live superheroes, much like Marvel does now. The whole Marvel universe. WCCW's at the time, their talent were just like superheroes. And they were there for the fans, and they put in the time and to work to make the fans love you. Jimmy Garvin would explain that it's hard to put into words just how special WCCW was to the fans, and not only to the fans, but to the people who got a chance to work there. And how he's just glad to be alive because by this point today, he shouldn't be with everything that went on. Kevin Von Erich would say that it's always the people you remember, and when his family suffered, it's like everyone suffered. They built this community. They built their own little family. The WCCW fans watched the Von Erich boys grow up on television. It was a labor of love. I really enjoyed this episode. I think it was a solid episode. And what I liked about this episode is they didn't dive too much into the tragedies. We all know the tragedy of the Von Erich family. They did keep it light. They kept it with fun stories. And it's great because most people, when they talk about WCCW and the Von Erichs, there's a lot of tragedy that's talked about. So we got to hear a lot of the lighter stories and what really made fans love the promotion. Next week, we're going to dive into JCP, Jim Crockett Promotions, probably the most famous promotion in the territories. We're going to be talking about Ricky Morton, Arn Ole Anderson, Baby Doll, Jim Cornette, probably some Ric Flair. I mean, when you think of NWA, that was like the main promotion. So I can't wait for you guys to join me and Pun next week as we talk about Jim Crockett Promotions. If you want to stay up to date with everything with the Four Corners Network, that's Territory Talk, the Four Corners Podcast. Plus, we're always updating our pages with news and rumors and scoops. You can find all that above my head this time at the Four Corners Net. That's at number 4 Corners Net on all social media platforms. And you can find me on all social media platforms at Rex Wrestles. That's at REX Wrestles. Thanks once again to each and every one of you for tuning into another episode of Territory Talk on the Four Corners Network. As always, be excellent to each other and keep supporting pro wrestling.